The iron grip on Elena's wrist left marks that took 3 weeks to fade. When the stagecoach door swung open and she stepped onto the sun-bleached dirt of Copper Ridge, she carried only two things: a battered carpet bag and the haunting certainty that this marriage to a stranger might be the only door left unlocked. Behind her lay a world of velvet curtains and violent whispers. Ahead stood a man whose letters promised kindness, but whose eyes held something harder: survival. She didn't know if she was running toward freedom or just trading one cage for another. If you want to see how far a woman can run before her past catches up, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like ash on Elena's shoulders. She sat rigid on the worn bench, fingers locked around the handle of her carpet bag, trying to steady her breath. The driver's voice cut through the stillness. "Copper Ridge, ma'am. End of the line." End of the line. The words felt heavier than they should. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the way her knees trembled, and stepped down into the glare of late afternoon sun. The town, if you could call it that, was little more than a scattering of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of nothing. A general store with peeling paint, a saloon with a crooked sign, a livery stable that smelled of manure and hay. Beyond that, just open land stretching endlessly under a sky too big to hide beneath. Elena pulled her shawl tighter, though the air was warm. Old habit. "Mrs. Ward?" The voice was low, careful. She turned and saw him for the first time. Rhett Calder stood a few feet away, hat in hand, dust on his boots. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved by wind and sun. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his eyes, blue, sharp, studied her with the kind of attention that made her pulse quicken. Not out of fear, not exactly. "Mr. Calder," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once. "Just Rhett. Welcome to Copper Ridge." There was no warmth in the words, but no cruelty either. Just fact. She studied him, looking for the man who'd written those careful letters over the past 6 months. Letters that spoke of land and weather and the quiet of the plains. Letters that never asked too much, never pushed too hard. He didn't look like a man who wrote letters. He looked like someone who kept his words locked up tight. "Your trunk?" he asked. "Just this," she said, lifting the carpet bag slightly. His gaze flicked to the bag, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, curiosity maybe, or confusion, but he didn't press. "All right then, we've got an hour's ride to the ranch. You ready?" She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. The wagon was simple, functional, the kind built for work rather than comfort. Rhett helped her up without lingering, his hand firm and brief against hers, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses moved without needing to be told, their rhythm steady and unbothered. They rode in silence. Elena kept her eyes on the horizon, watching the land unfold in shades of brown and gold and endless green. The vastness of it unsettled her. Back in Philadelphia, everything had walls, boundaries, places to hide. Out here, there was nowhere to disappear. "It's different from what you're used to," Rhett said eventually. "Yes. Harder, too." She glanced at him. His profile was all sharp angles and sun-worn skin, his jaw set in a way that suggested he didn't waste energy on things he couldn't control. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said. "Didn't say you were." Another stretch of silence. The wagon wheels creaked. A hawk circled overhead, lazy and patient. "Why'd you come?" he asked. The question landed like a stone in her chest. She'd known it would come eventually, had prepared answers, safe ones, the kind that kept the truth buried deep. But sitting beside this man who'd offered her a way out without asking for explanations, the lies felt heavier than usual. "I needed to leave," she said quietly. Rhett didn't look at her, just nodded, slow and deliberate. "Fair enough?" That was it. No prying, no demands, just acceptance, plain and unadorned. Elena exhaled, something tight in her chest loosening by the smallest degree. The ranch appeared as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and bruised purple. It wasn't much. A small house with a sagging porch, a barn that looked like it had survived a few too many storms, and a corral where a handful of horses stood watching their approach with mild interest. Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Home, he said, though the word came out flat, like he wasn't sure he believed it. Elena climbed down before he could offer help, her legs stiff from the ride. She stood there, taking it in. The stillness, the smell of earth and animals, the way the wind moved through the grass like something alive. It's quiet, she said. Yeah. Rhett grabbed her bag and started toward the house. You'll get used to it. She followed him up the steps, noting the way the boards groaned underfoot, the way the door stuck a little when he pushed it open. Inside, the house was dim and spare. A table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace that looked like it had seen a lot of use. Clean, but not cared for. Functional. Rhett set her bag down near the door. There's a room through there, he said, nodding toward a narrow hallway. It's small, but it's yours. I sleep out in the barn most nights anyway. Elena blinked. The barn? Gets cold in winter, but it's fine the rest of the year. Easier that way. Easier. She turned the word over in her mind, trying to understand what he meant. Easier for him? For her? You don't have to... I know, he said, cutting her off gently. But I will. At least until you're settled. She stared at him, searching his face for some hidden motive, some trap waiting to spring. But all she saw was exhaustion and something that looked almost like caution. Thank you, she said finally. He shrugged. There's bread and dried meat in the kitchen if you're hungry. Water's in the barrel out back. I've got some work to finish before dark, so I'll leave you to it. And just like that, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Elena stood alone in the quiet house, her heart beating too fast, her thoughts tangled and sharp. She moved to the window and watched as Rhett crossed the yard toward the barn, his stride long and unhurried. He didn't look back. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the ache in her wrist where the bruise was finally starting to fade. Freedom, she thought. This is what it's supposed to feel like. But she wasn't sure yet if she believed it. The first night, Elena didn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room Rhett had given her, staring at the ceiling while the house creaked and settled around her. Every sound made her tense, the wind rattling the shutters, the distant call of a coyote, the groan of old wood shifting in the dark. She told herself it was just the unfamiliarity, new place, new sounds. But the truth sat heavier in her chest. She was waiting. Waiting for footsteps. Waiting for the door to open. Waiting for the inevitable moment when kindness revealed itself as something else. It didn't come. When the sky began to lighten, she rose and dressed in the dim pre-dawn glow, smoothing her skirt with hands that still wanted to shake. She stepped out into the main room and found it empty, the fire cold, no sign that Rhett had been inside at all. The door to the barn stood slightly ajar. She hesitated, then crossed the yard, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and leather and horses. Rhett was already awake, mucking out a stall with methodical efficiency, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He glanced up when she entered, straightening slowly. "Morning." "Good morning," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "I can help?" "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward a pitchfork leaning against the wall. "All right. Start with the far stall. Toss the old hay into that wheelbarrow." Elena took the pitchfork, gripping it tighter than necessary, and got to work. The labor was hard, harder than she'd expected. Her arms burned, her back ached. Sweat dampened her collar, and her palms blistered despite her attempts to adjust her grip. But she didn't stop, couldn't, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Rhett worked beside her in silence, never offering help unless she asked, never commenting on her pace or her obvious inexperience. When the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, he finally set down his tools and nodded toward the house. "There's a pump out back. Get yourself some water." She followed his direction, finding the pump and working the handle until cold, clear water spilled into the basin below. She drank deeply, then splashed her face, letting the shock of it chase away the exhaustion for a moment. When she turned, Rhett was standing a few feet away, watching her with that same careful attention. "You've never done this kind of work before," he said. Not a question. "No." "Then why push yourself so hard?" "Because if I stop moving, I'll fall apart." But she didn't say that. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. Because I need to learn. He didn't argue, just nodded once and turned back toward the barn. Come on, I'll show you how to feed the horses. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm, awkward and uncertain, but a rhythm nonetheless. Rhett rose before dawn and worked until dusk, and Elena followed his lead, learning the routines of ranch life with stubborn determination. He taught her how to measure grain, how to check hooves for stones, how to mend a fence post without wasting nails. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were deliberate, purposeful. "You ever ridden a horse?" he asked one afternoon as they stood in the corral. "No." He gestured toward a chestnut mare standing nearby, her ears flicking lazily. "That's Rosie. She's the calmest one we've got. You should learn." Elena eyed the horse warily. "Why?" "Because out here you need to be able to move on your own. Can't always count on someone else to take you where you need to go." The words settled into her like stones. Independence. That's what he was offering. Not control, not ownership, just the tools to stand on her own. "All right," she said quietly. "Teach me." Rhett's mouth almost curved into something like a smile. He was patient. She'd give him that. He showed her how to approach Rosie, how to speak low and calm, how to let the horse get used to her presence before trying anything else. When he finally helped her into the saddle, his hands were steady and impersonal, lifting her just enough to get her seated before stepping back. "Hold the reins loose," he said. "She'll follow your weight more than your hands." Elena gripped the reins too tight anyway, her heart pounding as Rosie shifted beneath her. But the mare didn't bolt, didn't throw her, just stood there, patient and unbothered, waiting for direction. "Good," Rhett said. "Now just sit for a bit. Get used to the feel of her." She did. And slowly, the fear started to ebb. That night, Elena made dinner, simple fare, beans and cornbread, but edible. Rhett came in from the barn as the sun set, pausing in the doorway as if surprised to find the table set, food waiting. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." He washed his hands at the basin, then sat down across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks against tin plates. Halfway through the meal, Rhett spoke. "You flinch sometimes." Elena's fork stilled, her throat tightened. "I'm not asking why," he continued, his voice low, "but I want you to know, I won't be the reason you do it here." She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I believe you," she whispered. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it. The days bled into weeks, and Elena began to notice the small ways Rhett made space for her. He never entered a room without making noise first, never stood too close, never raised his voice, even when the horses were stubborn or the work went wrong. He asked before touching, even for practical things, handing her down from the wagon, steadying her when she stumbled on uneven ground. "You all right?" he'd say, his hand hovering just above her elbow until she nodded permission. It was strange, disorienting. She'd spent so long bracing for impact that the absence of it left her off balance. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, Elena finally found the courage to ask the question that had been circling her mind. "Why did you agree to this?" she said. "A mail-order bride. You could have found someone local, someone who knew this life." Rhett leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "I wrote those letters because I figured if I was honest about what this place was, hard, lonely, unforgiving, then whoever answered would be coming for the right reasons." "And what reasons are those?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Same as mine, because staying where you were wasn't an option anymore." Elena's breath caught. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he understood the weight of running. "I didn't lie in my letters," she said softly, "but I didn't tell you everything either. Didn't expect you to." He turned his gaze back to the horizon. "We all got things we don't talk about." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared, an unspoken agreement that the past could stay buried as long as they both needed it to. But Elena was learning something else too, that safety wasn't just the absence of danger, it was the presence of choice. And for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand what that felt like. Still, the quiet moments were the hardest. At night, alone in her room, The memories crept back in. The sound of footsteps in the hall, the way his voice would shift from charm to venom in the span of a breath, the cold pressure of his hand on the back of her neck, guiding her, controlling her, reminding her that she belonged to him. She'd wake in the dark, heart racing, convinced she could hear him calling her name. But the house stayed silent. And in the morning, Rhett would be in the barn, steady and unhurried, offering her work and purpose and the kind of respect she'd almost forgotten existed. One morning, she found him in the corral, working with a young stallion that clearly had no interest in cooperation. The horse bucked and wheeled, tossing its head, and Rhett moved with it, his voice calm and low, never forcing, never fighting. Elena leaned against the fence, watching. "He doesn't trust you yet," she said, when Rhett finally paused to catch his breath. "No," Rhett agreed, wiping sweat from his brow. "But he will. Just takes time." She looked at the horse, then back at Rhett. "How do you know?" "Because I'm not trying to break him, just trying to show him he's got a choice." The words hit her harder than they should have. She swallowed, her throat tight, and nodded. Rhett glanced at her, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You want to try?" "Me? Why not? I don't know the first thing about—" "Neither did I once." He opened the gate and gestured for her to step inside. "Come on. I'll be right here." Elena's pulse kicked up, fear and something else tangling in her chest. But she stepped forward anyway, moving slowly into the corral. The stallion eyed her warily, ears pinned back. "Easy," Rhett murmured, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. "Just let him see you. Don't push." She stood still, breathing slow, and waited. The horse took a step closer, then another. "Good," Rhett said softly. "Now reach out, palm flat." She did, her hand trembling slightly, and the stallion stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the horse pressed his nose into her palm. Elena exhaled, something tight and painful loosening in her chest. "See?" Rhett said quietly. "He just needed to know you weren't a threat." She nodded, blinking back the sting in her eyes, and kept her hand steady. That night, the nightmares came again. She woke gasping, tangled in sheets, the phantom weight of a hand on her throat making it impossible to breathe. She stumbled out of bed and into the main room, desperate for air, for space, for anything that didn't feel like suffocation. The front door opened before she reached it. Rhett stood on the threshold, lamp in hand, his expression tense. "Heard you moving around. You all right?" She wanted to lie. Wanted to say she was fine, that it was nothing, that he should go back to the barn and forget he'd heard anything. But the words wouldn't come. Her voice broke. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He set the lamp down on the table and stepped inside, keeping his distance. "Bad dream?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "You want to talk about it?" "No." "All right." He moved toward the fireplace and began building a fire, his movements calm and methodical. "But you shouldn't be alone right now." "I'm fine," she said automatically. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "You're shaking." She looked down and realized he was right. Her hands were trembling, her whole body taut with the effort of holding herself together. Rhett finished with the fire and straightened, brushing soot from his hands. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair nearest the hearth. "I'll make coffee." "You don't have to." "I know." She sank into the chair, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, and watched as he moved around the small kitchen with quiet efficiency. When he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and she didn't flinch. Progress, she thought. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, and Elena felt the fear begin to ebb. Not gone, but manageable. "He's not here," Rhett said eventually, his voice low. She looked up sharply. "What? Whoever's haunting you. He's not here, and he won't be." Her throat tightened. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "Because if he shows up, he'll have to go through me first." The certainty in his voice should have felt possessive, controlling, but it didn't. It felt like a promise, a line drawn in the dirt that said, "This far, no further." "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then stood. Get some rest. I'll be in the barn if you need me. And he left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone with the fire and the quiet and the slow, fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, she was finally safe. But safety, Elena was learning, was a luxury that didn't last long on the frontier. 3 days later, a rider came. Elena was in the garden, pulling weeds from the small plot she'd started near the house, when she heard the sound of hooves. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched as a man on a sleek black horse rode up to the gate. He was dressed too fine for Copper Ridge, tailored coat, polished boots, a hat that had never seen real work. His face was smooth, his smile easy, but there was something cold in his eyes, something familiar. Elena's stomach dropped. "Good afternoon," the man called, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for a woman. Goes by the name of Elena Ward. Would you happen to know where I might find her?" Her blood turned to ice. Rhett appeared from the barn, his stride long and purposeful, positioning himself between Elena and the stranger. "Who's asking?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Charles Brennan. I'm a business associate of her late husband's family. Just trying to track down a few loose ends." Lies. Every word. Elena forced herself to move, stepping forward even though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I'm Elena Ward." Charles's gaze slid to her and the smile sharpened. "Mrs. Ward. What a relief. I've been searching for you for quite some time." Rhett's hand drifted toward his belt where Elena knew he kept a knife. "State your business and move on." Charles chuckled, the sound smooth and practiced. "No need for hostility, friend. I'm simply here to deliver a message from the family. They're concerned about Mrs. Ward's well-being, want to make sure she's being properly cared for." "She is," Rhett said flatly. "I'm sure. But you see, there's the matter of certain legal obligations, contracts that were signed before her unfortunate departure." His gaze locked onto Elena, and she felt the weight of it like a hand around her throat. "They'd very much like her to come home." "I'm not going back," Elena said, her voice stronger than she felt. Charles tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was working out. "That may not be your choice to make, Mrs. Ward. There are documents, agreements, things that bind you, whether you like it or not." Rhett took a step forward. She said no. That's the end of it. "Is it?" Charles's smile turned sharp. "We'll see. Give my regards to the family, Mrs. Ward. I'll be in touch." He turned his horse and rode off, unhurried and confident, leaving silence in his wake. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She felt Rhett's gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Elena," he said quietly. "He won't stop," she whispered. "They won't stop. They never do." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." She finally looked at him and saw something fierce and unyielding in his eyes. "This isn't your fight," she said. "Yes," Rhett said simply. "It is." And for the first time since Charles Brennan rode into her life, Elena felt something other than fear. She felt hope. The dust from Charles Brennan's horse hadn't even settled before Rhett was moving. He didn't speak, didn't look at Elena, just turned on his heel and strode toward the barn with the kind of focus that made her chest tighten. She followed, her legs unsteady, her mind racing through everything Brennan had said. Legal obligations, contracts, things that bind you. Inside the barn, Rhett was pulling a wooden crate from beneath a pile of old tarps, his movements sharp and deliberate. He pried the lid open and reached inside, pulling out a rifle that looked well-maintained despite its age. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew. "Making sure we're not caught unprepared." He checked the barrel, his jaw set. "How many more like him should I expect?" "I don't know." "Guess." She wrapped her arms around herself, the chill settling deep despite the warmth of the afternoon. "He worked for my husband's family. They have money, influence. If they sent Charles, they'll send others." Rhett set the rifle down and turned to face her fully. "Your husband. He dead?" "Yes." "How long?" 7 months. He studied her, those blue eyes cutting through every defense she'd built. "And they still think they own you." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "His brother does. Marcus. He signed documents before the wedding, papers that gave the family control over my inheritance if something happened to William. I didn't know what I was signing. I was 19 and stupid, and my father needed the money. So they married you off? Yes. The word tasted bitter. And when William died, Marcus decided the arrangement still stood. Said I belonged to the family, that I had responsibilities. What kind of responsibilities? She hesitated, the memories clawing their way up her throat. He wanted me to marry him, to keep everything neat and legal, keep the money in the family. Rhett's expression didn't change, but something hard flickered behind his eyes. And when you said no, he didn't take it well. She touched her wrist unconsciously, fingers tracing the place where the bruise had finally faded. So I left, took what little I could carry, and answered your letter. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Rhett picked up the rifle again and handed it to her. You know how to use one of these? No. Then you're going to learn. Over the next 2 days, Rhett taught her to shoot. He set up targets in the far pasture, old cans lined up on fence posts, pieces of wood propped against rocks. The rifle was heavier than Elena expected, the kick harder, but she gritted her teeth and kept trying. Don't hold your breath, Rhett said, standing just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him but not touching. Breathe out slow, then squeeze. She did. The shot went wide, pinging off a rock 20 feet to the left of the target. Again. She reloaded, her hands clumsy with the unfamiliar motions, and tried once more. This time the bullet hit the fence post, splintering the wood. Better, Rhett said. But you're still flinching right before you pull the trigger. You expect the kick, so you tense up. I can't help it. Yeah, you can. You just have to trust the rifle to do what it's built for. Trust, that word again. Elena steadied herself, pushed down the instinct to pull away, and fired. The can flew backward, clattering to the ground. Rhett's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. There you go. She lowered the rifle, her arms aching, and looked at him. Why are you doing this? Teaching you to shoot? All of it. You could have sent me away the moment Brennan showed up, told me this wasn't your problem. He took the rifle from her hands and set it aside, his movements careful. Could have. Didn't want to. Why? Because you came here looking for something different, and I don't plan on letting some bastard in a fancy coat take that away from you. The bluntness of it caught her off guard. No flowery words, no promises he couldn't keep, just the plain truth, rough-edged and solid. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded once, then picked up the rifle again. Come on, let's go another round. That night, Elena couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't nightmares that kept her awake. It was the creeping certainty that Brennan wouldn't leave without a fight. She rose and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the yard bathed in moonlight. Everything looked still, peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness beyond the fence line. A sound behind her made her spin, her heart leaping into her throat. Rhett stood in the doorway, fully dressed, a lantern in one hand. You see something? No, She exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. I'm being paranoid. Paranoia keeps you alive out here. He moved to the window and scanned the yard, his expression unreadable. Nothing's moving, but that doesn't mean we let our guard down. Do you think he's still out there? Watching? Maybe. Brennan didn't strike me as the type to ride all this way just to deliver a message and leave. He wanted to see how you'd react. How I'd react. Elena's stomach twisted. And what did he see? That you're not alone anymore. Rhett turned from the window and met her gaze. That's going to make things harder for him. He was counting on you being isolated, easy to control. I was. Before. You're not now. The certainty in his voice steadied her, even as fear gnawed at the edges of her mind. She wrapped her shawl tighter and moved away from the window, suddenly exhausted. Get some rest, Rhett said. I'll keep watch. You can't stay up all night. I've done it before. She wanted to argue, but the set of his jaw told her it would be pointless. So she nodded and retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. But sleep didn't come. She lay in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of Rhett moving through the house, checking the windows, testing the locks, keeping her safe. The days that followed were tense. every small sound setting Elena's nerves on edge. Rhett didn't leave her alone, not out of distrust, but out of caution. He worked within sight of the house, always close enough to hear if she called out. She tried to keep busy, throwing herself into the routines of ranch life with a desperation that bordered on reckless. She fed the horses, hauled water, scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw. Anything to keep her mind from circling back to Brennan's cold smile and the certainty that he'd return. On the third day, Rhett found her in the chicken coop, wrestling with a stubborn hen that refused to leave its nest. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, leaning against the doorway. "I'm fine." "You've been out here for 2 hours. That's not fine." She finally managed to shoo the hen aside and grab the eggs, cradling them carefully in her apron. "I needed something to do. There's work, and then there's running yourself into the ground. You're doing the second one." She turned to face him, frustration bubbling up before she could stop it. "What else am I supposed to do? Sit around and wait for them to come back? I can't just—" Her voice cracked. She clenched her jaw, fighting for control. Rhett stepped closer, his voice low. "You can trust that I meant what I said. That when they come, we'll handle it." "You don't know them. You don't know what they're capable of." "No. But I know what I'm capable of." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "And I know that running yourself ragged isn't going to change what's coming." She wanted to argue, wanted to push back against the calm certainty he carried like armor. But the truth was, she was exhausted, terrified, and trying to outrun it was only making things worse. "I don't know how to just wait," she admitted. "Then don't wait. Prepare." He nodded toward the house. "Come on, I'll show you something." She followed him inside, and he led her to the small table where he'd spread out a hand-drawn map of the ranch and the surrounding land. Lines marked boundaries, circles indicated water sources, and X's noted places where the terrain was rough or impassable. "If things go bad," Rhett said, tapping a spot near the northern edge of the property, "there's a canyon here. Narrow entrance, hard to find if you don't know it's there. You can hide there if you need to." Elena stared at the map, her throat tight. "You think it's going to come to that? I think it's smart to have a plan." "And what about you? I'll make sure you get there first." The words landed like a stone in her chest. She looked up at him, searching his face for some hint of doubt or hesitation, but found none. "I'm not leaving you behind," she said. "Elena, no." Her voice was firm, surprising even herself. "You don't get to play the martyr. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." Something shifted in his expression, respect maybe, or surprise. He leaned back against the table and crossed his arms. "All right, together. But that means you listen when I tell you something's dangerous. And you listen when I tell you I'm not running anymore." A beat of silence. Then Rhett's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Deal." The truth settled between them, fragile but real. Elena looked down at the map again, committing the lines and markers to memory. She'd spent so long letting other people make decisions for her that the idea of having a say, of being part of the plan instead of just a piece to be moved, felt strange. But it also felt right. That evening, they ate dinner together in a silence that was almost comfortable. Elena had made stew from the dried beef and vegetables she'd found in the cellar, and though it was nothing fancy, Rhett ate like it was the best meal he'd had in months. "You're getting better at this," he said, nodding toward the pot. "Don't sound so surprised." Wasn't a criticism, just an observation. She glanced at him, caught the faint hint of amusement in his eyes, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Well, don't get used to it. I'm still learning." "Aren't we all?" They lapsed back into silence, but it was different now. Less guarded, less heavy. After they finished, Rhett stood and began clearing the table, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested he'd been doing it alone for a long time. Elena rose to help, and their hands brushed as they both reached for the same plate. She froze, her pulse spiking, old instincts screaming at her to pull back, but Rhett just stepped aside, giving her space. "You take that one. I'll get the rest." No pressure, no demand, just easy cooperation. Elena exhaled and picked up the plate, her hands steadier than they'd been a moment before. Later, as she sat by the fire mending a tear in one of Rhett's shirts, she'd insisted, despite his protests, that it didn't matter. She found herself watching him out of the corner of her eye. He was seated across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes, his face cast in shadow and firelight. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a way that ran deeper, like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had forgotten how to set it down. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He glanced up. "Go ahead." "Why were you alone out here? Before I came, I mean." His hand stilled on the whetstone. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the knife aside and leaned back in his chair. "I wasn't always," he said. "Had a wife once, Mary. We built this place together." Elena's breath caught. What happened to her? "Fever took her, 3 winters ago." His voice was flat, emotionless, but she could see the weight of it in the set of his shoulders. "Tried to get her to town, to a doctor, but the snow was too deep. By the time it cleared, she was gone." "I'm sorry." He shrugged, the gesture stiff. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it easier." "No," he admitted, "it doesn't." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Elena didn't know what to say. What words could possibly be enough for that kind of loss? So she just kept sewing, her needle moving in and out of the fabric in a steady rhythm. After a while, Rhett spoke again. "That's why I wrote those letters. Figured it was time to stop living like a ghost." Elena looked up, meeting his gaze. "Do you regret it? Asking me to come?" "No." The answer was immediate, certain. "Do you? Coming here?" She thought about it, really thought about it. The fear, the exhaustion, the constant looking over her shoulder, but also the quiet mornings in the barn, the way Rhett never pushed, the slow, tentative belief that maybe she could build something new. "No," she said. "I don't." Rhett nodded, something almost like relief flickering across his face. Then he picked up his knife again and went back to sharpening it, and the moment passed. But it stayed with Elena long after the fire burned down and she retreated to her room. She lay in the dark, thinking about Mary, about the life Rhett had lost, and the life he was trying to build again. And she realized with a jolt of clarity that they were both haunted, both trying to outrun ghosts that wouldn't let go. The difference was they were doing it together now. 4 days after Brennan's visit, a rider came again. This time it wasn't Brennan. It was a younger man, clean-shaven and nervous, sitting atop a dappled gray mare. He pulled to a stop at the gate and called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Calder, I've got a message for you." Rhett emerged from the barn, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. Elena stepped out onto the porch, her heart already racing. "Who's it from?" Rhett asked. "Charles Brennan, sir. He's staying at the boarding house in town. Says he'd like to speak with Mrs. Ward. Peacefully." "She's got nothing to say to him." The young man shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He said to tell you that if she doesn't come, he'll have no choice but to involve the law. Something about legal documents and a breach of contract." Elena's stomach dropped. "He can't do that." "He can try," Rhett said, his voice hard. He turned back to the messenger. "Tell Brennan that if he's got something to say, he can ride out here and say it himself. Otherwise, he can take his papers and his threats and get the hell out of Copper Ridge." The young man swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, kicking up dust in his wake. Elena gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. "He's not going to stop. He'll twist the law, bribe whoever he needs to, and make it look like I'm the one breaking the rules." "Let him try." Rhett climbed the steps and stood beside her, his presence solid and unshakable. "We'll go to town tomorrow, talk to the sheriff. Make sure he knows what's really going on. And if the sheriff's already been bought, then we deal with it." He met her gaze, his eyes fierce. "But we're not rolling over for this bastard. Understand?" She nodded, even as fear clawed at her insides. The ride into town the next morning was tense and silent. Rhett drove the wagon with one hand, the other resting on the rifle propped beside him. Elena sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Copper Ridge looked even smaller in the harsh light of midday, the buildings sagging under the weight of neglect. They passed the saloon, the general store, and the livery before pulling to a stop in front of a low building with a sign that read Sheriff. Rhett helped her down, his hand firm and steady, then led the way inside. The sheriff was an older man, gray-haired and thick around the middle, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He glanced up from his desk as they entered, his expression neutral. "Rhett," he said, "been a while." "Sheriff Talbot," Rhett nodded. "This is my wife, Elena." Talbot's gaze slid to her, assessing. "Ma'am, what brings you in?" "There's a man staying at the boarding house," Rhett said. "Charles Brennan. He's been making threats against Elena, claiming she's got legal obligations to him and his family." Talbot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "What kind of obligations?" Elena forced herself to speak, her voice steadier than she felt. "My late husband's family believes they have a claim on me. Documents signed before the marriage that they say give them control over my inheritance and my future. But I never agreed to any of it. I left Philadelphia to get away from them." "And Brennan followed you here?" "Yes." Talbot was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and pulled a piece of paper from his desk drawer. "He came in yesterday, filed a complaint, says you're in violation of a legally binding contract, and that he's here to escort you back to Philadelphia to settle the matter." Elena's breath left her in a rush. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Talbot's gaze was sharp. "Because he's got papers that say otherwise, signed and notarized." "I don't care what they say," Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's not going anywhere." "That's not your decision to make, son." "The hell it isn't. She's my wife." Talbot's eyes flicked between them, weighing something Elena couldn't name. "You got proof of that?" Rhett's jaw tightened. "We were married by proxy. I've got the documents back at the ranch." "Then I suggest you bring them in, because right now Brennan's got a legal leg to stand on, and you don't." The words hit like a slap. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, the walls closing in. "How much did he pay you?" she asked quietly. Talbot's expression hardened. "Watch yourself, ma'am." "No." She stepped forward, her voice gaining strength. "How much?" "Because I know how men like Brennan operate. They don't just file complaints, they buy cooperation." "That's a serious accusation. And it's the truth." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not going back to Philadelphia. I'm not property. And if you try to force me, you'll be complicit in whatever happens next." Talbot studied her for a long, tense moment. Then he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll look into Brennan's claims, but until I've got proof one way or the other, my hands are tied. You two best keep your heads down and stay out of trouble." "Trouble's already here," Rhett said. "We didn't bring it." Talbot didn't respond, just turned his back and busied himself with papers on his desk, a clear dismissal. Rhett took Elena's arm, gentle but firm, and led her out of the office. Outside, she gulped in air, her chest tight. "He's not going to help us." "No," Rhett agreed. "He's not." "So, what do we do?" He looked down at her, his expression grim but resolute. "We go back to the ranch. We get those documents, and then we make damn sure Brennan knows he picked the wrong fight." They were halfway back to the wagon when a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Ward!" Elena turned and felt her blood turn to ice. Charles Brennan stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house, impeccably dressed, his smile sharp and knowing. Beside him stood two men, hard-looking, with guns strapped to their hips and eyes that promised violence. "I thought we might talk," Brennan said, his tone pleasant. "Civilly." Rhett moved in front of Elena, his hand drifting toward his rifle. "She's got nothing to say to you." "I think she does." Brennan's smile widened. "You see, I've been very patient. I came all this way, extended every courtesy, and yet Mrs. Ward continues to act as though she has a choice in the matter. She doesn't." "Yes, I do," Elena said, stepping out from behind Rhett. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I'm not going back. Whatever papers you have, whatever lies you've told, they don't change the fact that I left, that I choose to stay here." Brennan's expression darkened. "You don't get to choose. You're bound by contract, by law, by family obligation." "Those aren't my obligations. They were forced on me." "Semantics." He took a step forward, and the two men at his side shifted, hands moving toward their guns. "You will return to Philadelphia, whether you come willingly or otherwise." Rhett raised the rifle, the movement smooth and deliberate. "Take one more step, and we'll see how willing you are to bleed for a piece of paper." Brennan stopped, his smile twisting into something uglier. You think you can protect her? You're a nobody, a dirt farmer with a falling down ranch and delusions of heroism. I have the law on my side. I have money. I have power. What do you have? Her, Rhett said simply, and that's more than you'll ever take. For a long moment, no one moved. The street was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Brennan laughed, cold and sharp. We'll see, Mr. Calder. We'll see. He turned and walked back into the boarding house, his hired men following, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Rhett didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled, and looked at Elena. Get in the wagon. We're going home. She climbed up without argument, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the seat. Rhett settled beside her and snapped the reins, urging the horses into motion. They didn't speak the entire ride back. When they reached the ranch, Rhett helped her down and immediately began securing the property, checking the locks, loading weapons, moving supplies closer to the house. Elena watched him work, her mind numb, her body exhausted. What happens now? She asked when he finally paused. Rhett set down the crate he'd been carrying and looked at her. Now we wait, and when they come, we make sure they regret it. They'll come with the law, with the sheriff. Maybe, but the law doesn't make them right. He crossed to her, standing close enough that she could see the hard set of his jaw, the fierce determination in his eyes. I meant what I said, Elena. I'm not letting them take you. Even if it costs you everything? Yeah, he said without hesitation. Even then. She stared at him, this man who'd offered her safety without asking for anything in return, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but something deeper than gratitude. Something that felt like trust, real and solid and unshakable. Then we fight, she said quietly. Rhett nodded. Then we fight. And as the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, Elena stood beside him and prepared for the storm she knew was coming. The storm didn't wait long. 2 nights after the confrontation in town, Elena woke to the sound of horses. Not the familiar rhythm of Rhett's animals shifting in the corral, but something harder, faster, purposeful. She was out of bed before her mind fully caught up, grabbing the rifle Rhett had left propped against the wall and moving toward the window. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the yard, and in that pale light she counted them. 6 riders, maybe 7. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she pulled on her boots and moved into the main room. Rhett was already there, dressed and armed, his face set in grim lines. How many? He asked without looking at her. 6 or 7? I couldn't tell. That'll be Brennan and his hired guns, plus maybe the sheriff. He checked his revolver, then slid it into his belt. You remember what we talked about? The canyon. If things go bad, you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just go. Rhett, promise me. She met his gaze and saw something raw there, something that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, for her. I promise, she said, the lie sitting heavy on her tongue. He nodded, then moved to the door. Stay inside until I call for you. What are you going to do? Talk first. If that doesn't work, he didn't finish. Didn't need to. Elena watched as he stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loose in one hand, his posture deceptively relaxed. She stayed back from the window, just far enough to see without being seen, her own rifle gripped tight enough to make her knuckles ache. The riders stopped at the gate. Charles Brennan sat at the front, still dressed like he was attending some society function, utterly out of place in the dust and darkness. Behind him were the 2 hired men from town, plus 4 others, all armed, all watching Rhett with the kind of dead-eyed focus that said they'd done this before. And there, off to the side, sat Sheriff Talbot on a gray mare, looking uncomfortable and trying hard not to show it. Mr. Calder, Brennan called out, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. I trust you've had time to reconsider our conversation. Wasn't much to reconsider, Rhett said. My answer's the same. That's unfortunate. Brennan dismounted, moving with the easy confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Because I've taken the liberty of securing a court order. Sheriff Talbot has been kind enough to witness it. Mrs. Ward is to return with me to Philadelphia to answer for her breach of contract. She's not going anywhere. Talbot shifted in his saddle. Rhett, Don't make this harder than it has to be. The law's the law. The law's whatever Brennan paid you to say it is. The sheriff's face darkened. Watch yourself. Or what? You'll arrest me for protecting my wife? Rhett's voice was steady, but Elena could hear the edge beneath it. You want to do that, Tom? You go ahead, but you better be ready for what comes after. Brennan stepped forward, his smile sharp. How noble, but ultimately pointless. You see, Mr. Calder, I don't need your cooperation. I only need Mrs. Ward, and one way or another, she's leaving with me tonight. Over my dead body, if necessary. Brennan's tone didn't change, pleasant and cold all at once, though I'd prefer to avoid unnecessary violence, so I'll make this simple. Send her out, and we'll leave peacefully. Refuse, and my men will retrieve her by force. Your choice. Elena's breath caught. She looked at Rhett's back, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had drifted toward the revolver at his hip. He was going to fight, and he was going to die doing it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. 6 armed men against 1. The odds were impossible. And even if by some miracle Rhett survived, Brennan would just come back with more men, more guns, more threats. This would never end, unless she ended it. Her hands were shaking as she set down the rifle and moved toward the door. Rhett must have heard her, because he half turned, his eyes widening. Elena, don't! But she was already stepping past him, out onto the porch and into the moonlight. Brennan's smile widened. Mrs. Ward, how sensible of you. I'll come with you, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. But only if you leave him alone. You take me, and you go. No one gets hurt. Elena, get back inside, Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. She ignored him, keeping her gaze locked on Brennan. Do we have a deal? Brennan tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he'd just solved. You care about him. How unexpected. Do we have a deal or not? Of course. I'm a man of my word. He gestured toward his horse. Come along, then. We have a long ride ahead of us. Elena started down the steps, her legs unsteady, but her resolve firm. She'd made it 3 steps when Rhett's hand closed around her wrist. Don't, he said quietly. Don't do this. She looked up at him, saw the anger and fear, and something else she couldn't name written across his face. I have to. No, you don't. Yes, I do, because if I don't, they'll kill you, and I won't let that happen. Elena, let me go, Rhett. For a moment, he didn't move. His grip on her wrist was firm but not painful, his eyes searching hers like he was looking for some way to change her mind. Then slowly, he released her. She wanted to say something. Thank you. I'm sorry. Don't forget me. But the words tangled in her throat. So she just turned and walked toward Brennan, her spine straight, her chin up. She'd made it halfway across the yard when the first shot rang out. It didn't come from Rhett or Brennan's men. It came from somewhere off to the left, beyond the fence line, and it hit the ground 2 feet in front of Brennan's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing him, and chaos erupted. Men shouted, guns were drawn, and Rhett grabbed Elena and hauled her backward toward the house as more shots cracked through the night. Stay down, he barked, shoving her behind the water trough and dropping into a crouch beside her. What's happening? She gasped. Don't know. But whoever's shooting isn't aiming to kill. Not yet. Another shot, this one close enough that Elena felt the air move. She pressed herself flat against the ground, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her chest. From the darkness beyond the fence, a voice called out, rough and gravelly and completely unfamiliar. That's far enough, Brennan. You and your boys turn around and ride out, or the next shot won't be a warning. Brennan, who'd managed to get his horse under control, scanned the darkness with wild eyes. Who's there? Show yourself. Don't need to show myself, just need you to listen. The lady said she's not going with you. That means you leave. Now. One of Brennan's hired men raised his rifle, but before he could fire, another shot rang out and the weapon flew from his hands, clattering to the ground. The man yelped and clutched his arm, blood already seeping through his sleeve. Next one goes through bone, the voice said calmly. Your call. Sheriff Talbot had gone pale, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Now hold on. You hold on, Tom. You rode out here with a fraudulent court order and armed thugs. Far as I'm concerned, you forfeited the right to talk. Rhett's expression shifted, recognition flickering across his face. Hank? Evening, Rhett. Figured you could use a hand. From the shadows emerged a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same rough stone as the land itself. He was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and a rifle that looked like it had seen more battles than most men survived. He moved with the kind of easy confidence that said he'd done this before and wasn't particularly worried about doing it again. Brennan's composure was cracking, his voice rising. "This is illegal. You can't just..." "Can't just what? Defend a man's property from trespassers? Pretty sure I can." Hank stopped at the fence line, his rifle still trained on Brennan. "Now, you gonna leave or do I need to make this unpleasant?" Brennan looked at his men, at the blood on the wounded one's sleeve, at the dark shapes moving in the shadows. More people, Elena realized, though she couldn't tell how many. "This isn't over," Brennan said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Yeah, it is," Hank replied. "You just don't know it yet." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Brennan jerked his horse's reins and wheeled around, his men scrambling to follow. Talbot hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something, but Hank just raised the rifle a fraction of an inch, and the sheriff kicked his horse into motion. They rode off into the darkness, and the silence that followed felt almost heavier than the gunfire. Rhett stood slowly, helping Elena to her feet. "You all right?" She nodded, though her legs felt like water. "Who is that?" "Hank Morrison. Runs the ranch to the north. We've been neighbors for years." Rhett moved toward the fence, and Elena followed, still shaky. Hank lowered his rifle as they approached, a crooked grin splitting his weathered face. "Hell of a night." "You didn't have to do that," Rhett said. "Sure I did. Neighbors look out for each other." Hank's gaze shifted to Elena, assessing but not unkind. "You must be the new Mrs. Calder. Heard you'd arrived." "Thank you," Elena managed. "I don't know what would have happened if... Best not to think about it." Hank turned and gestured to the shadows. "Come on out, boys. Show's over." 3 more men emerged, all carrying rifles, all looking like they'd stepped out of the same hard life that had shaped Hank. They nodded to Rhett, tipped their hats to Elena, and began to disperse. "How'd you know to come?" Rhett asked. "Saw those bastards riding this way earlier. Figured it wasn't a social call." Hank spat into the dirt. "Plus, word gets around. Heard Brennan's been making noise in town about dragging some woman back east. Didn't sit right." "We appreciate it. Don't mention it, but Rhett..." Hank's expression turned serious. "This ain't over. Brennan's the type who doesn't let go easy. He'll be back, and next time he'll bring more men. You need to be ready." "I know." Hank clapped him on the shoulder. "You need help. You send word. We'll come." "Why?" The question came from Elena before she could stop it. "Why would you risk yourselves for people you barely know?" Hank looked at her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Because out here, we're all we've got. You don't turn your back on that. Not ever." He nodded once more, then turned and walked off into the darkness, his men following like shadows. Elena stood there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Rhett's hand found hers, warm and solid, and she gripped it like a lifeline. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get inside." They didn't sleep that night. Rhett kept watch from the window while Elena sat at the table, her rifle across her lap, her mind churning through everything that had happened. She'd been ready to go, ready to sacrifice herself to keep Rhett safe, and he'd been ready to die to keep her here. The weight of that settled over her like a blanket, heavy and suffocating and strangely comforting all at once. "You shouldn't have done that," Rhett said without turning from the window. "Tried to trade yourself. You were going to get yourself killed." "Maybe, but that was my choice. And leaving was mine." He turned then, his expression hard. "Your choice would have gotten you dragged back to Philadelphia and locked in some gilded cage for the rest of your life. That's not a choice. That's surrender. And your choice would have gotten you killed," she shot back, her voice rising. "How is that better?" "Because at least I'd have died free." The words hit her like a slap. She stared at him, seeing the raw honesty in his face, and felt something crack inside her. "I don't want you to die," she said quietly. "Free or not, I don't want that." Rhett's expression softened, just slightly. "Then we're even, because I don't want you in a cage." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Rhett turned back to the window, and Elena forced herself to breathe. Dawn came slow and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Rhett finally stepped away from the window and sat down across from Elena, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "We can't stay here," he said. "What?" "Brennan's going to come back, and when he does, he'll bring an army. We can't fight that, not even with Hank's help." Elena's stomach twisted. "So what do we do?" "We go to the territorial judge in Silver Creek. It's 3 days' ride, but if we can get there, we can file a counterclaim, get the real story on record." "And you think that'll stop Brennan?" "I think it'll make it harder for him to operate. Right now, he's got the law on his side because nobody's challenged him. We change that. We change the game." Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to think there was a way out of this that didn't end in blood, but doubt gnawed at her, sharp and persistent. "What if it doesn't work? Then we figure out the next step." He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm. "But we do it together. No more trying to sacrifice yourself. Understood?" She nodded, her throat tight. "Understood." They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Rhett loaded supplies into saddlebags, dried meat, hardtack, blankets, ammunition, while Elena gathered what few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind. It wasn't much. A spare dress, a small wooden box that held the letters Rhett had written before she'd come west. She paused over that box, running her fingers over the worn edges. Those letters had been her lifeline when everything else was crumbling. They'd promised honesty and hard work and a life that didn't require her to be anything other than herself. And Rhett had kept that promise, even when it cost him. She tucked the box into her bag and went to find him. He was in the barn, saddling Rosie and his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Flint. He glanced up as she entered, his movements efficient and practiced. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." He handed her Rosie's reins. "We'll ride hard for the first day, put as much distance between us and here as we can. After that, we take it steady. No point running the horses into the ground." Elena nodded and swung herself into the saddle, the motion still awkward but getting easier. Rhett mounted Flint and led the way out of the barn, pausing only to glance back at the ranch one last time. The house looked small and fragile in the gray morning light, the barn leaning slightly to one side, the fence posts in need of repair. It wasn't much, but it had been a refuge, a place where Elena had started to believe she could be someone other than what she'd been forced to be. "We'll come back," Rhett said, as if reading her thoughts. "When this is over, we'll come back and make it right." "You promise?" "Yeah, I promise." They rode out, leaving the ranch behind, and headed east toward Silver Creek. The first day was brutal. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only to water them and let them rest for brief intervals before moving on. The land was rough and unforgiving, all scrub brush and red dirt and rocks that could break a horse's leg if you weren't careful. Elena's body ached from the constant jarring motion. Her thighs rubbed raw despite the layers of fabric between her and the saddle. But she didn't complain. Couldn't afford to. Rhett set a punishing pace, his jaw tight, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was looking for riders, for dust clouds, for any sign that Brennan had sent men after them. By the time the sun started to sink, Elena was half convinced she'd fall out of the saddle. But Rhett finally slowed, guiding them toward a narrow canyon with a trickle of water running through it. "We'll camp here," he said, dismounting. "It's defensible, and the water's good." Elena slid down from Rosie, her legs nearly buckling as her feet hit the ground. Rhett caught her elbow, steadying her, and she leaned into him for just a moment before forcing herself upright. "I'm fine," she said. "You're exhausted. So are you." He didn't argue, just led the horses to the water and began stripping off their saddles, his movements methodical despite the fatigue. Elena gathered wood for a fire, her hands clumsy and slow. By the time she had a small blaze going, Rhett had the horses settled and was unpacking their supplies. They ate in silence, dried meat and hardtack that tasted like dust, and watched the shadows lengthen across the canyon walls. "How far did we get?" Elena asked eventually. "Maybe 20 miles. Not as far as I'd hoped, but it'll do." "And how far is Silver Creek?" "Another 60, give or take." She did the math in her head and felt her heart sink. 3 more days like this. Maybe 4. "You think Brennan's following us?" she asked. "I'd bet on it." Rhett poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "But he doesn't know this land like I do. That'll buy us time." How much time? Enough. She wanted to believe him, but the fear sat heavy in her chest, cold and unshakable. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Elena's shift came in the early hours before dawn, and she sat with her back against a boulder, the rifle across her knees, listening to the sounds of the wilderness around her. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance. The fire crackled and popped. Rhett's breathing was slow and steady where he lay wrapped in his bedroll a few feet away. She watched him sleep, this man who'd become something more than just a stranger offering shelter. He'd risked everything for her, was still risking everything. And she realized, with a jolt that stole her breath, that she'd do the same for him, not out of obligation, not out of gratitude, but because somewhere along the way, in the quiet mornings and the long, hard days, she'd started to care. The thought terrified her. When dawn broke, they saddled up and rode on. The second day was worse than the first. The terrain rougher, the heat more oppressive. Elena's hands blistered from gripping the reins, her back a constant ache, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Rhett pushed them hard again, though he was limping slightly by the time they stopped for the night. Elena noticed but didn't comment. He wouldn't appreciate it. They made camp in a shallow depression surrounded by scrub brush, and Elena insisted on tending to the horses while Rhett built the fire. He looked like he wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out and he nodded. When she returned, he'd managed to get a decent blaze going and was heating water in a battered tin pot. "Coffee?" she asked hopefully. "If you can call it that." He handed her a cup and she wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. They sat in silence, too tired for conversation, and watched the stars emerge one by one. "You ever think about going back?" Rhett asked suddenly. Elena looked at him. "To Philadelphia?" "Yeah." "No." The answer was immediate, certain. "There's nothing for me there. Even if Brennan disappeared tomorrow, I wouldn't go back." "Why not?" She thought about it, trying to put into words the tangle of emotions that had driven her west. "Because that version of me doesn't exist anymore. The girl who let herself be traded like property, who stayed silent while her life was decided for her, she's gone. And I don't want to be her again." Rhett studied her, his expression unreadable. "Who do you want to be?" "I don't know yet." She looked down at her hands, rough and blistered and strong. "But I'm figuring it out." "Yeah," he said quietly. "You are." On the third day, they reached the fork in the trail that would take them north toward Silver Creek. Rhett reined in Flint and studied the landscape, his expression tense. "What is it?" Elena asked. "Riders, coming from the south." She followed his gaze and saw the dust cloud rising in the distance, still small but growing. "How many?" "Can't tell yet, but it's more than one." Her heart kicked into a gallop. "Brennan?" "Probably." Rhett turned Flint and urged him forward. "Come on, we need to move." They rode hard, pushing the horses faster than was safe, the rough terrain blurring past in shades of brown and green. Elena clung to the saddle, her pulse pounding in her ears, every muscle screaming in protest. Behind them, the dust cloud grew closer. Rhett led them off the main trail and into a narrow ravine, the walls steep and close. The horses stumbled on loose rock. Their breathing labored, but Rhett didn't slow. "There," he said, pointing to a gap in the rock face. "Through there." It was barely wide enough for a horse to pass, but Elena urged Rosie forward and squeezed through, the stones scraping against her legs. On the other side, the ravine opened into a small clearing surrounded by high walls. A dead end. "Rhett!" "I know." He dismounted and pulled his rifle from its holster. "But they'll have to come through single file. That gives us an advantage." "There's 6 of them, maybe more. What kind of advantage is that?" "The kind where they can't surround us." He moved to the gap and peered out, his jaw tight. "Get down. Stay behind that rock." Elena slid from the saddle and crouched behind a boulder, her rifle in hand, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. The sound of hooves echoed through the ravine, growing louder, closer. And then they were there. Charles Brennan emerged first, his face flushed with anger and exertion, his eyes wild. Behind him came his hired guns, their weapons drawn, their expressions flat and cold. Rhett stepped into the gap, blocking their path, his rifle raised. "That's far enough." Brennan pulled his horse to a stop, breathing hard. You can't run forever, Calder. Wasn't planning on running, just getting to someone who'll listen to the truth. The truth? Brennan laughed, sharp and bitter. The truth is that woman belongs to my family. The truth is you're harboring stolen property. And the truth is you're going to hang for it. Only if you make it out of here to tell anyone. One of the hired men raised his gun, but Rhett fired first, the shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. The bullet hit the rock wall above the man's head, showering him with stone fragments. Next one goes through flesh, Rhett said calmly. Your call. Brennan's face twisted with rage. Kill him. Kill them both if you have to. Just bring me the woman. And all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the narrow space. Elena ducked low, her hand shaking as she raised her own rifle and fired blindly toward the gap. She didn't know if she hit anything, didn't care. She just kept firing, reloading, firing again. Rhett was a blur of motion, his shots precise and controlled, forcing Brennan's men back. But there were too many of them, too many guns, too much firepower. A bullet ricocheted off the boulder beside Elena, sending chips of rock flying. She felt something hot graze her shoulder and gasped, pressing her hand to the wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, but it wasn't deep. Elena? Rhett's voice cut through the chaos. You hit? I'm fine. But she wasn't. None of this was fine. And then, through the smoke and noise and chaos, she heard it. More gunfire. But not from Brennan's men, from behind them. Rhett lowered his rifle slightly, his expression shifting from grim determination to something like hope. Hank! Through the gap came Hank Morrison and his men, rifles blazing, cutting off Brennan's retreat. The hired guns scattered, some trying to return fire, others bolting for the open trail. Brennan wheeled his horse, eyes wild, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. Drop your weapons, Hank barked. All of you. Now! Slowly, reluctantly, Brennan's men complied. The gunfire ceased, leaving only the echo of it ringing in Elena's ears. Rhett moved forward, his rifle still trained on Brennan. It's over. Brennan's face was pale, his hands shaking. You don't know who you're dealing with. I have connections. You have nothing, Rhett said flatly. Not anymore. Hank dismounted and walked over to Brennan, grabbing the man's reins. You're coming with us. We'll let the judge sort this out. Brennan opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Hank's face silenced him. Elena lowered her rifle, her whole body trembling. It was over. Really over. Rhett crossed to her, his hands gentle as he checked her shoulder. You're bleeding. It's just a graze. Still needs tending. He pulled a bandana from his pocket and pressed it to the wound, his touch careful. You did good. I didn't do anything, just fired and hoped. You stood your ground. That's something. She looked up at him, saw the exhaustion and relief written across his face, and felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. We made it, she whispered. Yeah, he said. We did. And for the first time since Charles Brennan had ridden into her life, Elena allowed herself to believe it. The ride into Silver Creek took another full day, but this time they weren't running. Hank and his men flanked them on both sides, rifles ready, while Brennan and his surviving hired guns rode in the middle with their hands bound and their weapons confiscated. Sheriff Talbot had disappeared somewhere during the firefight, fled back to Copper Ridge, most likely, to save his own skin. Elena's shoulder throbbed with each step Rosie took, but she kept her face neutral, her spine straight. She wouldn't give Brennan the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. He rode ahead of her, his expensive coat dusty and torn, his face pale beneath the grime. Every so often he'd glance back, his eyes full of venom, but he didn't speak. What was there to say? He'd lost, and they both knew it. Rhett stayed close to Elena's side, his presence steady and watchful. He hadn't said much since the shooting stopped, just checked her wound twice more and made sure she had water. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his revolver. It wasn't over yet. Not really. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold. The town was bigger than Copper Ridge, a proper settlement with a main street lined with storefronts, a bank, a hotel, and at the far end a courthouse with whitewashed walls and a bell tower. People stopped what they were doing to watch as their procession rode through. Women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands. Men in work clothes stepped off the boardwalk to get a better look. A few children ran alongside, their eyes wide with curiosity. Hank led them straight to the courthouse and dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "Wait here," he said to Rhett, then disappeared inside. Elena shifted in her saddle, her legs cramping, her shoulder burning. Rhett noticed and moved closer. "You need to get down," he said quietly. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding through the bandage." She looked down and saw he was right. A dark stain had spread across the fabric of her dress. "It's not that bad." "Elena." The way he said her name, firm but not harsh, concerned but not condescending, made her relent. She let him help her down, and the moment her feet hit the ground, her knees buckled. Rhett caught her, his arms solid around her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." She leaned into him for just a moment, letting herself take the comfort he offered, then forced herself upright. "I can stand." "I know you can, but you don't have to." Before she could respond, Hank emerged from the courthouse with another man, tall, gray-haired, with sharp eyes, and the kind of face that looked like it didn't tolerate nonsense. He wore a black suit and carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent years making decisions that mattered. "This is Judge Carver," Hank said. "He'll hear your case." Carver's gaze swept over the group, lingering on Brennan and his bound men before settling on Elena and Rhett. "Inside, Gus. All of you. This needs to be handled properly." The courtroom was simple. Wooden benches, a raised platform for the judge's desk, and windows that let in the fading afternoon light. Hank's men brought Brennan and the hired guns in first, positioning them on one side of the room, while Elena and Rhett took seats on the other. Judge Carver settled behind his desk, pulled out a ledger, and opened it with deliberate care. "Mr. Morrison tells me there's been an incident. Let's start with names. You first." He pointed at Brennan. Brennan straightened, trying to summon some of his earlier arrogance. "Charles Brennan, representing the estate of William Ashford of Philadelphia. I'm here on legal business, too." "I didn't ask for your life story, just your name." Carver's tone was flat. He turned to Elena. "And you?" "Elena Ward, formerly Elena Ashford." "You're the widow?" "Yes." "And you?" He looked at Rhett. "Rhett Calder. Elena's my wife." Carver made a note in his ledger. "All right. Mr. Brennan, you first. State your claim." Brennan launched into his prepared speech, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. He talked about contracts and legal obligations, about how Elena had been bound to the Ashford family through documents signed before her marriage to William. He described her departure from Philadelphia as theft, not just of herself, but of assets that belonged to the estate. He painted her as a runaway, a woman who'd abandoned her responsibilities and needed to be brought back to answer for her crimes. He made it sound reasonable, lawful, like he was the victim. Elena's hands clenched in her lap as she listened, her nails digging into her palms. Every word was a carefully constructed lie, designed to make her sound like the villain in a story Brennan had written himself. When he finished, Judge Carver sat back and studied him for a long moment. "You have documentation for these contracts?" "Of course." Brennan produced a folded stack of papers from inside his coat and handed them over. Carver took his time reading through them, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he set them down and looked at Elena. "Your turn, Mrs. Ward. Or is it Mrs. Calder?" "Calder," she said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "And those papers Mr. Brennan just showed you, they were signed under duress." "Explain." She took a breath and began. She told him about her father's debts, about how the Ashford family had offered to clear them in exchange for her hand in marriage. She described the wedding, cold, transactional, more like a business deal than a union. And then she told him about William. "He wasn't cruel," she said carefully. "Not at first, but he drank. And when he drank, he got angry. And when he got angry—" She paused, her throat tight. "He reminded me that I belonged to him, that I was property, bought and paid for." "Did he hurt you?" "Yes." Carver's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Go on." She told him about William's death, a fall from his horse while drunk, sudden and violent. About how Marcus Ashford, William's brother, had taken over the estate and decided that the contract transferring control of her inheritance still stood. About how he'd demanded she marry him to keep everything legal. "I refused," Elena said, And that's when things got worse. Define worse. She showed him her wrist, where the faint shadow of bruises still lingered. Marcus made it clear that my cooperation wasn't optional, so I left. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride and came west. And married Mr. Calder. Yes, Carver turned to Rhett. You have proof of this marriage? Rhett reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Married by proxy 6 months ago. Witnessed and notarized. The judge examined it, compared it to Brennan's papers, then set both aside. Mr. Brennan, you claim Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Calder, stole from the estate. What exactly did she take? Brennan's jaw tightened. Jewelry, family heirlooms, cash. How much cash? Approximately $2,000. Elena's breath caught. That's a lie. I took $50, money I'd saved from household accounts. And the only jewelry I have is my mother's wedding ring. Nothing from the Ashfords. Do you have this ring? She held up her hand, showing the simple gold band on her finger. It was worn and dented, nothing like the ornate pieces the Ashford family favored. Carver made another note. Mr. Brennan, do you have evidence of this theft beyond your word? The family reported it to the authorities in Philadelphia. That's not evidence, that's an accusation. Carver leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Let me be clear. You rode into my territory with armed men, pursued this woman across rough country, and engaged in a gunfight that could have gotten people killed, all over a contract that, by my reading, has no legal standing outside of Pennsylvania. Is that about right? Brennan's face flushed. The law. The law says that a woman who remarries is no longer bound to her previous husband's family. The law also says that coercion invalidates contracts. And the law says that you, Mr. Brennan, have no jurisdiction here. Carver's voice was hard as stone. You want to make a case in Philadelphia, you're welcome to try. But out here, in my court, you've got nothing. This is outrageous. What's outrageous is that you thought you could ride into Silver Creek with hired guns and intimidate people into compliance. Carver stood, his expression cold. Here's my ruling. The marriage between Mrs. Calder and Mr. Calder is legal and binding. Any contracts signed prior to that marriage are void. Mrs. Calder is free to remain here or go where she pleases, and you, Mr. Brennan, are to leave this territory immediately and not return. Brennan shot to his feet. You can't. I just did. And if you're smart, you'll take it, because if you don't, I'll charge you with attempted kidnapping, assault, and whatever else I can make stick. Carver's gaze swept over the hired guns. As for these men, they're free to go as long as they leave with you. But if any of you set foot in this territory again, you'll answer to me. Understood? Silence. Then slowly Brennan nodded, his face twisted with barely suppressed rage. Good. Get out of my courtroom. Hank's men escorted Brennan and his crew out, and the room emptied until only Elena, Rhett, and the judge remained. Elena sat frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. It was over. Really, truly over. Carver closed his ledger and looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. You all right, Mrs. Calder? Yes. Thank you. Don't thank me. I just did my job. He turned to Rhett. You take care of her and get that shoulder looked at. Rhett nodded. We will. They left the courthouse as the last of the daylight faded, stepping out into a street that felt different somehow. Quieter. Safer. Elena stopped on the boardwalk and just breathed, letting the reality of it sink in. She was free. Brennan was gone. The law was on her side. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the future wasn't something to fear. Rhett stood beside her, close but not touching, his gaze scanning the street out of habit. We should find a place to stay tonight, get that shoulder cleaned up properly. There's a hotel, Hank said, coming up behind them. Not fancy, but it's clean. I'll cover the cost. You don't have to do that, Elena said. I know, but I'm going to anyway. Hank tipped his hat. You two have had a hell of a few days. Get some rest. We'll head back to Copper Ridge in the morning. Rhett clasped his hand. Thank you. For everything. Like I said, neighbors look out for each other. Hank grinned. Besides, it's been a while since I had that much excitement. Almost felt young again. He walked off, and Elena watched him go, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. Community. That's what this was. People who barely knew her, risking themselves because it was the right thing to do. She wasn't used to it, wasn't sure she deserved it, but she was grateful for it all the same. The hotel room was small and plain, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the street. Rhett set their bags down and immediately went to work building a fire in the small stove, while Elena sank into the chair by the window. Her shoulder was on fire now, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving only pain in its wake. She pressed her hand to it and winced. Rhett noticed. "Let me see." She hesitated, old instincts warring with new trust, then nodded and let him help her out of her dress. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, and peeling it away from the wound made her gasp. "Sorry," Rhett murmured. He fetched water and clean cloth from the washstand and began cleaning the wound with careful, gentle movements. "Bullet grazed you pretty good, but it's not deep. You were lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky." "Yeah, well, could have been worse." He worked in silence, his touch steady and sure, and Elena found herself watching his face. There were lines there she hadn't noticed before, around his eyes, across his forehead, marks left by years of hard living and harder losses. "Why'd you do it?" she asked quietly. He glanced up. "Do what?" "Risk everything for me." "You didn't have to. You could have sent me away the moment Brennan showed up, saved yourself the trouble." Rhett's hand stilled. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Because you deserved better," he said simply, "and because I wasn't going to let another person I cared about get hurt if I could stop it." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. "You care about me?" Elena's voice came out softer than she intended. "Yeah," Rhett said. "I do." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to name the tangle of emotions rising in her chest. So she just nodded and let him finish bandaging her shoulder. When he was done, he stepped back and started to turn away, but Elena caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Rhett's fingers tightened around hers, warm and solid. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." They stood there for a moment, hands linked, something unspoken passing between them. Then Rhett cleared his throat and pulled away, his expression carefully neutral. "You should get some rest. I'll take the floor." "Rhett, it's fine. You need the bed more than I do." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a weight. So she nodded and climbed into the bed, still wearing her chemise and petticoat, and pulled the thin blanket over herself. Rhett settled on the floor near the stove, his coat rolled up as a pillow, and within minutes his breathing had evened out into sleep. Elena lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling everything that had happened. The fear, the gunfire, the moment she'd thought Rhett might die, and the way he'd looked at her when he said he cared. She didn't know what that meant yet. Didn't know if it was the same thing she was starting to feel, this pull, this connection, this sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. But she knew one thing for certain, she wasn't running anymore. Morning came too soon, pale light filtering through the window and pulling Elena from a sleep that had been deeper than she expected. Her shoulder ached, but it was a dull throb now, manageable. Rhett was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the street below. "Anything?" she asked. "No sign of Brennan. Hank's men saw him and his crew ride out before dawn. They're gone." Elena sat up slowly, testing her shoulder. "You think he'll try again? Go back to Philadelphia and come at us another way?" "Maybe, but it'll be harder now. Carver's ruling is on record. And Brennan knows that if he shows his face here again, he won't get a second chance. Still doesn't mean he's given up." "No," Rhett admitted. "But it means we've got time to breathe, to figure out the next step." Elena stood and moved to the washstand, splashing water on her face. "What is the next step?" "We go home. Fix up the ranch. Live our lives." He glanced at her. "Unless you want something different." She thought about it, really thought about it. A month ago, she would have jumped at the chance to disappear, to keep running, to never stop moving long enough for the past to catch up. But now? Now the idea of going back to that quiet ranch, of building something with her own hands, of waking up each morning without fear? It sounded like the closest thing to peace she could imagine. "No," she said. "I want to go home." Rhett's expression softened, just for a moment. All right then, let's go home. They left Silver Creek mid-morning, riding alongside Hank and his men. The journey back felt different, slower, less urgent. The land stretched out around them in shades of gold and green, the sky wide and endless overhead. Elena watched Rhett as they rode, noting the way his shoulders had lost some of their tension, the way he sat easier in the saddle. He looked lighter somehow, like a burden had been lifted. Maybe it had, for both of them. They stopped to water the horses at a creek, and Hank came over to where Elena stood, stretching her legs. "You did good back there," he said. "In the courtroom. Took guts to stand up to Brennan like that." "I didn't have much choice." "There's always a choice. You could have folded, could have let fear win." He tipped his hat back and squinted at the horizon. "But you didn't. That says something." "What does it say?" "That you're tougher than you think." Elena didn't know how to respond to that. She'd never thought of herself as tough. Stubborn, maybe, desperate, but not tough. "Thank you," she said finally, "for helping us. We wouldn't have made it without you." Hank shrugged. "Like I keep saying, neighbors look out for each other. Besides, Rhett's good people. Known him a long time. He deserves someone who'll stand with him, not against him. He told me about his wife, Mary. Yeah, that was hard. Damn near broke him." Hank glanced over at Rhett, who was checking Flint's hooves. "But he's coming back to himself. Little by little. You being here? That's part of it." The words settled over Elena like a blanket, warm and heavy. She'd come west thinking she was just saving herself. But maybe, in some small way, she'd saved Rhett too. They reached Copper Ridge late on the second day, the sun sinking low and casting long shadows across the dusty street. Hank and his men split off to head back to their own ranch, leaving Elena and Rhett to continue on alone. The ranch appeared as twilight deepened, the house silhouetted against the darkening sky. It looked the same as when they'd left, small, weathered, leaning slightly to one side. But to Elena, it looked like home. They dismounted and led the horses into the barn. Rhett stripped off their saddles while Elena filled the water troughs, the familiar routine settling over them like a well-worn coat. When they were finished, they stood in the barn doorway and looked out at the land spreading before them. "It's quiet," Elena said. "Yeah, I like it." Rhett glanced at her, something almost like a smile tugging at his mouth. "Me too." They walked to the house together, and Rhett pushed open the door. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. The table, the chairs, the cold fireplace. But it felt different now. Less like a temporary shelter and more like a place they both belonged. Rhett built a fire while Elena unpacked their supplies, and soon the small space was warm and filled with the smell of coffee. They sat across from each other at the table, exhaustion pulling at them both, but neither ready to sleep yet. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now we rebuild, fix the fence, patch the barn roof, get ready for winter." "That's not what I meant." Rhett set down his cup and looked at her. "What did you mean?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean with us. We married by proxy because I needed an escape and you needed, what? Company? Someone to cook and clean? Is that what you think?" "I don't know what to think." She wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. "We've been through so much in such a short time, but I don't actually know you. Not really, and you don't know me." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You want to know me? All right. I'm 43 years old. I came west when I was 20 because I couldn't stomach the life my father wanted for me back in Ohio. I built this ranch with my own hands, married Mary when I was 25, lost her when I was 40, spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life." He paused. "And then you showed up. And that changed things?" "Yeah, it did." Elena's throat tightened. "How?" "Because you reminded me that life doesn't stop just because you've lost something, that you can start over even when you think it's too late." He met her gaze, his eyes steady. "You want to know what I need? I need someone who's not afraid of hard work. Someone who can stand on their own, but doesn't mind standing together. Someone who looks at this broken-down ranch and sees something worth fighting for." "And you think that's me?" "I know it is. I've seen it." The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked down at her hands, rough and scarred from weeks of labor, and felt something shift inside her. "I'm not easy to live with," she said quietly. "I have nightmares. I flinch at things I shouldn't. I don't trust easily. Neither do I. And I don't know if I can be what you need. You already are." She looked up and saw nothing but honesty in his face. "This doesn't have to be complicated," Rhett continued. "We take it one day at a time, no expectations, no pressure. Just two people trying to build something decent in a hard world." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I can do that." "Yeah. Yeah." Rhett's expression softened, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. "All right then, one day at a time." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling, the night settling around them. And Elena realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. They worked the ranch together, mending fences, repairing the barn roof, clearing brush. Rhett taught her to ride better, to shoot straighter, to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. And slowly, carefully, they started to learn each other. Elena discovered that Rhett sang while he worked. Old songs, off-key and self-conscious, but it made her smile every time. She learned that he hated beans but would eat them without complaint. That he read books by candlelight when he thought she was asleep, old volumes of poetry that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. And Rhett learned that Elena talked to the horses when she thought no one was listening. That she had a stubborn streak a mile wide and a temper to match. That she was fiercely protective of the small garden she'd started, defending it from rabbits and deer with the same determination she'd shown facing down Brennan. They didn't talk about the past much. Didn't need to. It was there, a shadow that would always follow them, but it didn't define them anymore. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elena turned to Rhett. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Bringing me here?" He didn't answer right away, just sat there, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "No," he said finally. "Do you? Coming here?" "Not anymore." He glanced at her, and something passed between them, understanding maybe, or something deeper. "Good," he said simply. And Elena leaned back in her chair, feeling the last of the fear finally let go, and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found what she'd been looking for all along. A place to belong, a person to trust, and a life that was finally, truly her own. Winter came early that year, sweeping across the plains with a ferocity that caught even Rhett off guard. The first snow fell in mid-November, blanketing the ranch in white and transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and brutal. Elena stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes fall thick and fast, and felt a tremor of unease. She'd never experienced a frontier winter before. Didn't know what to expect beyond Rhett's warnings about being prepared. "We've got enough firewood?" she asked. Rhett looked up from where he was repairing a bridle at the table. "For now, but I'll need to cut more before the ground freezes solid. I can help." "I know you can." He set down the leather and stood. "But right now we need to make sure the barn's secure. Wind like this can tear a roof clean off if it finds a weak spot." They bundled up in heavy coats and gloves and fought their way through the wind to the barn. Inside, the horses shifted nervously, spooked by the howling outside. Elena moved among them, speaking low and calm, running her hands along their necks until they settled. Rhett climbed up into the rafters to check the roof, his movements careful on the icy beams. Elena watched from below, her heart in her throat every time he shifted his weight. "It's solid," he called down finally, "but we'll need to clear the snow off regular. Too much weight and the whole thing could collapse." "How often is regular?" "Every few hours if it keeps coming down like this." Elena nodded, already calculating the logistics in her head. Sleep would be scarce, but they'd manage. They always did. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of relentless wind and snow, of fighting their way to the barn and back, of huddling by the fire and rationing their supplies. On the third night, as they sat close to the stove trying to stay warm, Rhett reached over and took Elena's hand. "You holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine." "You're shivering." "So are you." He squeezed her hand gently. "Come here." She hesitated, old instincts flaring, but the cold won out over fear. She moved closer, and Rhett wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. The warmth of him was immediate and overwhelming. "Better?" he asked. "Yeah." They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind shriek outside, and Elena realized something. She wasn't afraid of his touch anymore. Hadn't been for weeks, really, but this was different. This was choosing to be close, not just tolerating it. "Rhett?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for not giving up on me." His arm tightened slightly. "Wasn't ever going to." "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That I was worth the trouble." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Because I know what it's like to feel broken. And I know that broken doesn't mean worthless." The words settled into her chest, warm and solid, and she let herself lean into him fully. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was transformed. Snow covered everything in deep drifts, sparkling under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Rhett and Elena dug their way out of the house, shoveling a path to the barn, their breath coming in clouds. The work was brutal, but there was something satisfying about it too. Something that felt like claiming space, like refusing to be buried. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Elena stopped to catch her breath and turned to find Rhett watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just you look different." "Different how?" "Stronger, like you've settled into yourself." She thought about that, about the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach months ago, terrified and desperate and so used to hiding that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. That woman felt like a stranger now. "I feel different," she admitted. "I feel like I can breathe." Rhett nodded slowly. "Good. That's how it should be." The winter months were hard, but they faced them together. They learned each other's rhythms, the unspoken language of people who work side by side. Rhett learned when Elena needed space and when she needed company. Elena learned when Rhett's silence was contentment and when it was grief. They talked more too. Late at night by the fire, when the darkness made it easier to speak truths that felt too heavy in daylight, Rhett told her about Mary, really told her, not just the bare facts. How they'd met at a barn dance in the next county over. How she'd laughed at his terrible jokes and challenged him to races she always won. How she'd worked as hard as any man and never complained, even when things got desperate. "I loved her," he said quietly. "Still do, in a way, but that doesn't mean there's no room for anything else." Elena understood what he was saying, what he was offering. She told him about William, too. About the early days when she'd tried to convince herself it could work, that maybe he'd be kinder once they were married. About the slow realization that kindness was never part of the equation, and about the relief she'd felt when he died, followed immediately by the crushing guilt of being relieved. "You're allowed to feel that," Rhett said. "Relief doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. I used to think something was wrong with me, that I was the problem. You weren't. You're not." The simple certainty in his voice made her throat tight. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting in fits and starts. The land revealed itself again, muddy and raw, and with it came the work of planting and rebuilding. Elena threw herself into it with a determination that surprised even her. She planted a larger garden, worked until her hands were blistered and her back screamed, and refused to quit. This land, this place, it was hers now. She'd earned it with sweat and stubbornness, and she wasn't letting it go. One afternoon in late April, as she was weeding between rows of young plants, a rider appeared on the horizon. Elena's heart kicked into a gallop, old fears rushing back, but Rhett's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "Easy," he murmured. "That's just the mail carrier." The rider approached and handed Rhett a small bundle of letters. Rhett sorted through them, his expression puzzled, then held one out to Elena. "This one's for you." She took it with trembling hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the return address from Philadelphia. For a moment, she considered throwing it into the fire unread, but curiosity won out. She tore it open and scanned the contents, her eyes widening. "What is it?" Rhett asked. "It's from a lawyer. Not the Ashford's lawyer, a different one. He says—" She paused, reading again to make sure she understood. "He says Marcus Ashford is dead, died 3 months ago, and before he died he signed documents relinquishing all claims on me and my inheritance." Rhett's eyebrows rose. He what? There's more. Apparently, Judge Carver's ruling made its way back to Philadelphia. Some kind of formal inquiry was launched into the Ashford family's business practices. They found evidence of fraud, extortion, and… She stopped, her hands shaking. Marcus knew he was going to be arrested, so he settled his affairs, including me. You're free. I'm free. The words felt strange in her mouth, too big and too light all at once. Rhett pulled her into his arms, and she let herself collapse against him, the letter crumpling between them. She didn't cry, couldn't quite process it enough for tears, but she held on tight, anchoring herself to this man who'd given her the space to find her own strength. What do you want to do? He asked eventually. She pulled back and looked up at him. What do you mean? I mean, you're not bound to anything now. Not to me, not to this place. You could go back to Philadelphia, claim your inheritance, start over somewhere else. The suggestion should have been tempting, should have sparked some flicker of interest, but all Elena felt was a deep, bone-certain knowing. I don't want Philadelphia, she said. I don't want the money or the life that comes with it. I want this. She gestured to the ranch, the garden, the vast sky overhead. I want here, with you. Something fierce and tender flickered across Rhett's face. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He kissed her then, slow and careful, like he was still learning how, and Elena kissed him back, no longer afraid of wanting something for herself. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and hard work. The garden flourished, the horses thrived, and slowly, so slowly Elena almost didn't notice, the ranch started to look less like a place that was just surviving and more like a place that was alive. Hank and his wife Martha came to visit in July, bringing fresh bread and news from town. They sat on the porch drinking lemonade while Martha, a stout, practical woman with sharp eyes and a warmer heart than her husband, quizzed Elena about everything from her garden to her marriage. He treating you right? Martha asked bluntly. Elena glanced at Rhett, who'd gone red and was suddenly very interested in his boots. Yes, he is. Good. Because if he wasn't, I'd box his ears, and Hank would help me. I would, Hank confirmed, grinning. They stayed for dinner, and the conversation flowed easily. Talk of weather and crops and the new schoolteacher in Copper Ridge, normal things, the kind of things people who weren't running from anything talked about. After they left, Rhett and Elena sat in the growing twilight, tired but content. They like you, Rhett said. I like them. Martha's already planning to invite you to some quilting circle thing. Elena laughed. I don't know how to quilt. She'll teach you. She teaches everyone. Do I have to go? Only if you want to. Rhett glanced at her. But it might be nice, having friends, people who aren't me. Elena considered that. Friends, community. The kind of roots that went deeper than survival. Yeah, she said. It might be. The seasons turned, and with them came a rhythm that felt less like endurance and more like living. Elena learned to quilt, badly at first, but Martha was patient. She learned the names of all the neighbors within a day's ride. She learned that Copper Ridge had a harvest festival every October, and that Rhett was terrible at dancing but would do it anyway if she asked. And she learned that happiness wasn't some grand, sweeping thing. It was small moments, morning coffee on the porch, Rhett's off-key singing, the first tomatoes from her garden, the way the light hit the land at sunset. It was enough. More than enough. One evening in late September, as they finished mending a section of fence, Rhett set down his hammer and turned to her. I've been thinking, he said. About? About building an addition onto the house. Make it bigger. More rooms. Elena's heart skipped. Why? He shrugged, trying for casual and failing. In case we need the space. Rhett called her. Are you asking me if I want children? His ears went red. I'm saying if you did want them, someday, we'd need more room. Elena set down her own tools and moved closer. Do you want them? Yeah, maybe, if you do. She thought about it. About a child growing up on this land, learning to ride and shoot and stand on their own. About a family built not on obligation, but on choice. Yeah, she said softly. Maybe I do. Rhett's smile was wide and genuine, and he pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. All right then, We'll build. That winter was milder than the first, and they used the time to work on the addition. It was slow going, just the two of them, with occasional help from Hank and a few others, but by the time spring arrived, they had 2 new rooms framed and half-roofed. Elena stood in what would eventually be a second bedroom, imagining it filled with light and life, and felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Really, truly home. In May, she realized she was pregnant. She didn't tell Rhett right away. Wanted to be sure. Wanted to let the knowledge settle into her bones before she shared it. But one morning, as she was fighting down nausea and trying to act normal, Rhett caught her hand. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." "Elena." She looked up at him and saw the concern in his eyes, the way he was already bracing for bad news. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. For a moment, he just stared. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen, and he lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her around. "Careful," she yelped. "You'll make me sick." He set her down immediately, looking sheepish. "Sorry, I just... Are you sure?" "Pretty sure." "And you want this?" "Yeah," she said, and realized it was true. "I do." Rhett kissed her, long and deep, and when they broke apart, he was still grinning like a fool. "We're having a baby." "We are. I need to finish that addition." "You have time." "Not enough." He was already mentally cataloging what needed to be done, and Elena laughed at the sudden panic in his eyes. "Rhett, we'll be fine." He stopped and looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded. "Yeah, we will." The pregnancy was hard. Elena was sick for the first 3 months, exhausted for the next 3, and uncomfortable for the final stretch. But Rhett was patient, taking over more of the work, never complaining when she snapped at him out of sheer frustration with her own body. Martha came by weekly, bringing advice and supplies and a calm presence that Elena desperately needed. She taught Elena what to expect, how to prepare, and never once made her feel stupid for not knowing. "You're doing fine," Martha said one afternoon as they folded tiny clothes Elena had sewn. "Better than fine, actually. I don't feel like it. Nobody does. That's the secret they don't tell you. Everyone's terrified and just pretending they're not." "Were you scared? With your first?" "Scared out of my mind. Hank was worse, though he tried to hide it." Martha smiled at the memory. "But you get through it. And then there's this tiny person who depends on you, and somehow you figure it out." Elena folded another shirt, her hands careful on the soft fabric. "What if I'm not good at it? What if I mess them up?" "Then you'll be like every other parent who's ever lived. Nobody's perfect, Elena. You just do your best and hope it's enough." The words were strangely comforting. Not perfect, just enough. The baby came in January during a cold snap that froze everything solid. Martha and Rhett were both there, and Elena labored through the night, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. It was brutal and bloody and terrifying, and when it was finally over and Martha placed the baby in her arms, Elena was shaking so hard she could barely hold on. "It's a girl," Martha said gently. Elena looked down at the tiny red-faced creature in her arms and felt something crack open in her chest. Love, fierce and immediate and overwhelming. "She's perfect," she whispered. Rhett leaned over, his eyes wet, and touched one finger to the baby's tiny hand. "What do we call her?" Elena had been thinking about this for months, cycling through names, but nothing had felt right. Now, looking at her daughter's face, the answer came easily. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Rhett's throat worked. "Hope called her. I like it." Over the next few months, Elena learned what Martha had meant about figuring it out. There was no manual, no perfect way to do things, just trial and error and a lot of sleepless nights. But there were also moments of pure, uncomplicated joy. Hope's first smile, the way she gripped Rhett's finger with her whole hand, the soft weight of her sleeping on Elena's chest. It wasn't easy, but it was good. One evening, when Hope was 6 months old, Elena stood on the porch holding her daughter while Rhett worked in the corral. The sun was setting, painting everything gold, and Elena felt a peace so deep it almost hurt. She thought about the woman she'd been, terrified, controlled, convinced she'd never be more than what other people made her. And she thought about the woman she was now, a mother, a wife, a person who'd fought for the right to choose her own life and won. The journey between those two versions hadn't been smooth. It had been messy and painful and full of moments where she'd wanted to give up. But she hadn't. And that mattered. Rhett finished with the horse and walked over, wrapping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything? Nothing." She leaned into him. "How far we've come." "Yeah." He kissed her temple. "We've come a long way." They stood there in the fading light, their daughter between them, and Elena let herself feel the full weight of what they'd built. Not just a ranch or a family, but something more fundamental. A life where she wasn't afraid, where she could be angry or sad or joyful without punishment, where she could take up space and make noise and be messy and human. Freedom, she realized, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the presence of choice, the ability to say yes or no and have it matter. The power to write your own story instead of living in one someone else had written for you. And she'd claimed that freedom. Not perfectly, not without scars, but she'd claimed it all the same. The years passed and the ranch grew. They added more horses, expanded the garden, built a proper barn to replace the old one. Hope grew into a wild, fearless child who was equally comfortable in the saddle or in the dirt, and who asked endless questions about everything. When she was 4, Elena gave birth to a son they named James, and 2 years after that, another daughter, Alice. The house that had once felt too big for 2 people was suddenly full of noise and chaos and life. Elena learned that motherhood was both harder and easier than she'd imagined. Harder because she wanted so desperately to get it right, to give her children what she'd never had. Easier because Rhett was always there, solid and steady, sharing the weight. They fought sometimes. About money, about how to handle the kids, about whether they needed to expand the ranch or stay small. But they always came back to each other, always found their way through. Because that's what partnership was, Elena learned. Not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to work through it, to choose each other over and over, even when it was hard. One summer evening, when Hope was 10 and helping her father mend a fence, Elena stood in the garden with James and Alice, showing them how to tell when the tomatoes were ripe. "Mama, why do we have to grow our own food?" Alice asked, her face scrunched in concentration. "Because it's important to know how to take care of yourself," Elena said. "So you're never dependent on someone else for the things you need." "But we have Papa." "Yes, we do. But even with Papa, you need to know you can stand on your own. Understand?" Alice nodded seriously, and Elena felt a fierce pride. Her daughter would never have to trade herself for survival. Would never have to choose between freedom and safety because she'd been taught from the beginning that she deserved both. That night, after the children were asleep, Elena and Rhett sat on the porch like they had 1,000 times before. The land stretched out before them, wild and beautiful, and theirs. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Elena asked. "If I hadn't answered your letter, if you hadn't taken a chance on a stranger?" "Sometimes," Rhett admitted, "but then I think about what we have now, and I can't imagine it any other way." "Me neither." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think we saved each other. You needed a place to run to. I needed a reason to stop hiding, and somehow we found both in each other." Elena thought about that, about the truth of it. She'd come here broken and desperate, expecting nothing more than survival. But she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found herself. Not the version she'd been told to be. Not the version shaped by fear and control, but the version she chose. Flawed and strong and fiercely, stubbornly alive. "I love you," she said quietly. Rhett squeezed her hand. "I love you too." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, one by one, filling the vast sky. And Elena let herself feel the full weight of her life. Not perfect, not easy, but entirely, completely hers. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. Not the erasure of the past, but the refusal to let it define the future. She'd been told her whole life that she was property, that her value was in what she could provide to others, that her voice didn't matter. But she'd learned the truth. She mattered. Her voice mattered. And the life she built with her own hands, on her own terms, was worth every scar it took to claim it. Years later, when Elena was old and her children were grown with children of their own, she would sit on that same porch and tell her grandchildren the story. Not a fairy tale. Not a romance where everything was smooth and easy. but the truth, messy and hard and real. She'd tell them about running, about fear, about the moment she decided to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. And she'd tell them the most important lesson she'd learned, that freedom isn't given, it's taken, it's fought for, it's claimed inch by bloody inch, against every voice that says you don't deserve it. But it's worth it, because a life lived on your own terms, even if it's hard, is worth more than a comfortable cage ever could be. And in the end, when Elena Calder closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and the land she'd claimed, she did so knowing one thing with absolute certainty. She'd been free. Really, truly free. And that made all the difference.